Imagine this. You live in the early days of post-revolutionary America. The United States is brand new, barely finding its footing, and amidst this chaos, a group of settlers in the Appalachian Mountains decides, why not make our own state? Sounds like a bold move, right? Well, that's exactly what happened in the case of Franklin, the state that almost was. Welcome to History's Hidden Tales. Today, we're diving into one of America's strangest near misses, Franklin, the 14th state that never officially joined the Union. To understand Franklin, we need to set the stage. The Revolutionary War had just ended, and the fledgling United States was swimming in debt. The 13 colonies turned states were figuring out how to govern themselves, and the western frontier was a wild and largely lawless place. The entire nation was grappling with what it meant to be truly independent. It was a moment in time when everything seemed possible, both the good and the bad. The sense of optimism clashed with confusion as newly minted Americans asked, how do we form a working government that holds this brand new country together? This was no small question. The Declaration of Independence had set forth ideals of liberty, equality, and self-governance. But in 1784, the reality on the ground was chaotic, especially out west in rugged territories far from the established eastern cities. One of the westernmost areas was part of North Carolina, a rugged stretch of land west of the Appalachian Mountains. This region was challenging to reach from North Carolina's eastern coastal centers. Roads were crude, and terrain was unforgiving. This meant communication and administrative oversight were spotty at best. Settlers living in these mountains were isolated, fiercely independent, and tired of being ignored by North Carolina's government. Imagine having to travel for days, or even weeks, just to pay taxes or to have a legal matter resolved. Those logistical hurdles created an environment where people felt more connected to each other locally than they did to distant officials. So it's not surprising that many yearned for a more direct, responsive system of governance. In 1784, North Carolina decided it was too broke to manage its far-flung western counties, so it ceded the land to the federal government. At this time, North Carolina, like most states, was saddled with Revolutionary War debt. The push to offload financial burdens was a common theme in the post-war economy. By giving up its claim to the western counties, North Carolina hoped to relieve itself of administrative costs. But just months later, North Carolina changed its mind and took the land back. Confused yet? So were the settlers. Imagine your local government one day telling you, we're no longer responsible for you, and we're handing you over to the federal government, only to reverse course shortly after and say, never mind, you're still under our control. If it sounds chaotic, it was. In August 1784, the settlers held a convention and declared independence from North Carolina. They called their new state Frankland, which means land of the free. Later, they changed it to Franklin in honor of, you guessed it, Benjamin Franklin, because who better to name your state after than America's favorite founding father? Franklin embodied the revolutionary spirit. He was an inventor, a diplomat, and a symbol of American ingenuity. By naming their state after him, these settlers were making a statement. They were claiming legitimacy and linking themselves to the very ideals that had shaped the nation. And yet, despite this symbolic choice, Ben Franklin wasn't exactly thrilled. But here's the thing, Ben Franklin wasn't exactly flattered. He politely declined to support the new state, saying he was too busy with other matters. Translation, he wanted no part in this frontier drama. He was, after all, deeply involved in national politics and diplomacy, and the idea of an upstart state in the mountains might have seemed like a risky bet. Supporting Franklin, the would-be state, could have put him at odds with established states, or it could have embroiled him in a protracted dispute between North Carolina and the settlers. Whatever his private thoughts, his public stance was that he had to remain focused on more pressing national concerns. Franklin's leaders wasted no time setting up a government. They drafted a constitution, created a court system, and even elected John Sevier as their governor. Now, John Sevier was a Revolutionary War hero and a larger-than-life figure in the region. He had served with distinction in numerous frontier skirmishes and was already a local legend. To the settlers, he was the perfect person to lead their new state. He was charismatic, brave, and deeply respected among the frontier communities. Sevier's leadership style was hands-on. He was known to engage with local militias and address the concerns of the people directly. This direct engagement was one of the reasons he rose to prominence. He wasn't an aloof politician. He was a man of action. But Franklin's government wasn't exactly smooth sailing. For starters, Franklin didn't have widespread support. Some settlers were loyal to North Carolina, while others just wanted to avoid taxes altogether. The region wasn't monolithic. It was filled with individuals and families who had their own agendas. Even if many admired John Sevier, they didn't necessarily want a new layer of government telling them what to do. And Franklin also struggled with finances. There wasn't enough money to run a government, and attempts to collect taxes didn't go over well at all. People had just fought a war that was partly about unfair taxation, so the mere idea of taxes from a new government structure was a tough sell. Factor in the harsh economic realities of frontier life, where barter and trade often took precedence over hard currency, and it's no surprise that the Franklin leadership faced an uphill battle. In 1785, Franklin's leaders petitioned the U.S. Congress to be admitted as the 14th state. They needed at least 9 out of 13 states to agree. The result? They got 7. Close, but no cigar. This vote is a fascinating glimpse into the political climate of the time. While some states might have sympathized with Franklin's plight, others worried that recognizing Franklin would encourage more frontier areas to break away from their parent states. The U.S. was already fragile enough. Adding new, half-formed states with disputed borders could further weaken the Union. Congress knew that North Carolina wasn't wasn't eager to lose land, and there was a risk of sparking conflict if they approved Franklin. In the end, the majority of states voted no, leaving Franklin in a precarious legal limbo. Without official recognition from Congress, Franklin was stuck in limbo. North Carolina wasn't about to let them go, and the federal government wasn't stepping in to help. This led to serious tension in the region. The settlers had declared themselves independent, formed a government, and tried to get recognized, only to find that the rest of the country wasn't ready to validate their bold experiment. If you put yourself in their shoes, you can see how frustrating it must have been. They'd done everything they could think of to legitimize Franklin, yet they were still viewed as rebels or squatters by the powers that be. As time went on, Franklin's relationship with North Carolina got worse. By 1788, North Carolina sent troops to reclaim the territory, leading to clashes with Franklin supporters. What started as an administrative dispute evolved into a more direct confrontation, with armed men on both sides believing they were in the right. North Carolina maintained that these counties were rightfully under its governance, while Franklin insisted it was a separate entity fighting for self-determination. The problem was that Franklin had no solid legal standing, and it lacked the backing of Congress or any external ally who could mediate or legitimize its claims. Fighting broke out in scattered incidents across the region, and these skirmishes underscored just how tenuous Franklin's existence really was. In a nation that was only a few years old, the last thing American leaders wanted was a mini civil war in the mountains. And just when you think it couldn't get messier, John Sevier, the same guy who led Franklin, ended up being arrested by North Carolina authorities. Talk about a plot twist. Sevier's arrest was not just a personal blow to him, it symbolized the collapse of Franklin's attempts at legitimacy. He had been the face and the voice of the movement. Having him apprehended eroded Franklin's credibility even further. Though Sevier was a hero to many in the region, outside that circle, he was starting to be seen more as a rogue figure defying the lawful authority of North Carolina. This spelled disaster for Franklin. By 1789, Franklin was finished. North Carolina regained control of the territory, and the idea of a 14th state quietly faded away. Despite the initial enthusiasm, lack of financial resources, insufficient military support, and zero federal recognition all led to Franklin's downfall. Most of the area eventually became part of Tennessee when it joined the Union in 1796, and that transition is an interesting chapter in its own right. Tennessee's path to statehood involved bridging the gap between East and West, managing land disputes, and making sure the new state could sustain itself economically. In many ways, the remnants of Franklin simply folded into the emerging structure of what would become the state of Tennessee. It was almost as if Franklin had been a trial run, a test of whether frontier regions could organize themselves effectively. So why didn't Congress help? Franklin? Part of it was timing. In 1785, the Articles of Confederation were still the governing document of the United States, and the federal government under these articles was notoriously weak. It lacked the power to mediate effectively in disputes between states, and it couldn't levy taxes to support such mediation. The Constitutional Convention was just around the corner, taking place in 1787, but by then, Franklin's fate was already sealed by its poor relationship with North Carolina and by local infighting. Frontier life was never easy. Beyond the political maneuvering, families in the Franklin region struggled with day-to-day survival. Hunting, farming, and occasional trading trips across mountain passes were the norm. Settlers worried about raids, conflicts with Native American tribes, disease, and the lack of reliable infrastructure. Under such conditions, building a functional government was a tall order. You had to maintain roads, if you could even call them that, establish courts to settle land disputes, and figure out how to protect isolated settlements. The area desperately needed a structured approach, but it was unclear whether Franklin could provide that order, especially once North Carolina made it clear that it wasn't going to stand by and let a rebel government flourish. All these factors, economic, political, geographical, collided to create a perfect storm that spelled the end for Franklin. Still, it wasn't a complete loss. The experience galvanized many settlers, teaching them lessons in self-governance and political organization. When Tennessee finally emerged as a state in 1796, a lot of the frontier spirit and local leadership that had energized Franklin carried over into Tennessee's early governance. In some ways, Franklin was the blueprint for how frontier areas could coordinate themselves. The difference was, Tennessee had the advantage of federal backing and a more favorable political climate when it sought statehood. When we look at the big picture, Franklin's attempt at statehood was a bold move that ultimately came up short. But imagine if they had succeeded. Would they have been able to overcome the logistical nightmares of providing schooling, policing, and public works across the rugged mountains? How would they have negotiated treaties with Native American tribes or settled boundary disputes with Kentucky and Virginia? These are the what-if scenarios that make history so captivating. It reminds us that the path we ended up taking wasn't necessarily inevitable. It was the result of a series of decisions, power plays, and sometimes plain old luck. That concludes our journey into the lost state of Franklin. Whether you see Franklin as a doomed venture or a noble experiment, it remains a fascinating footnote in America's expansion westward. It also serves as a reminder that our country's early years were far from settled. The stories that often don't make it into the main pages of history books are sometimes the ones that shed the most light on how challenging it was to unify 13 colonies into a single nation and eventually expand that nation across a continent. So, what do you think? Could Franklin have survived as the 14th state, or was it doomed from the start? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this trip into history's hidden tales, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.